Hello everybody, and welcome to Quora Top Stories. With us, you can hear the top real-time stories, put by a real person, wherever and whenever you like. And, we are doing a whole series on amazing and interesting cop stories. Want to hear the fun stories involving the police officer? Stay tuned with us on the series of cop stories, in Top Quora Stories. And today we are here, with another amazing cop question. Hope you guys will like it. The question goes like, what is the best experience you have had with a police officer? Mike Douglas, former journalist, retired used car dealer, says,
Cop offered to let me use his jail as a hotel room when I was nearly broke. As a 17-year-old U.S. airman, in the waning days of the Vietnam War, I was driving to my first duty station at Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota. After basic in Texas, I went home on leave. In September 1972, bought a new 1973 Chevrolet Vega. I then began the interstate trek from Philadelphia to the frozen, missile-rich north. The base was in flyover country, 20 miles south of the Canadian border. I was young and stupid, and thought I could do the 1,600-mile drive without stopping, since it was all interstate highway. By nightfall, I was in the foggy mountains of western PA, and eventually found Interstate 80 West in the mist. I kept trucking. This is when I hit a detour, because of interstate repair. It was exhausting, negotiating all the late night, big rig traffic, and I kept nodding off. No place to stop. On the detour, I encountered a T intersection, got confused, and pulled out in front of a tractor trailer, loaded with live cattle. I wound up in the hospital in Garner, Iowa. Car was totaled. Miraculously, I had only a minor head injury, and spent the night in the local 10-bed infirmary. The truck driver and the cows were fine. Truck had a bent bumper. The next morning, I was released, and the local cop was waiting for me. I figured I was getting charged for causing the accident, and was under arrest. Nope. We spent the day together. He showed me the tiny town. We went to the highway in his cruiser. He insisted I work his radar gun and catch speeders. Essentially, he taught me how to fish. When his shift ended, he took me to the town's brand new jail, and said, "We got no prisoners, haven't had since this jail opened, and there is no bus for 3 days, so you're welcome to stay here." I sputtered, coughed, declined, and he relented and took me to the town's only hotel, which looked like a vacation destination from a Hitchcock movie. No TV. No nothing. Shared bath at the end of the hall. Jail was 4 stars. This was a 1 star. About 7 p.m., there was a knock at the door. It was the cop. He had the doctor in tow, who treated me. The doctor said, "My wife told me to come fetch you. Come to my house for dinner." I said, "No thanks." He said, "My wife said you'd say that. If you knew her, you'd realize this is non-negotiable." The cop nodded. I went. I ate. I played Monopoly with the couple's charming kids. Next day, after spending the night at Doc's house, Mrs. Doc said I was a child, and wasn't going back to that dump. The cop picked me up. I checked out of the Bates Motel, and decided to hitchhike the rest of the way. Got picked up by a Minnesota nice couple, who drove 3 hours out of their way to deliver me to the base. People. Go figure.
Was this all sheer luck? He got help in almost every step. First, the police officer with whom he got well acquainted, and then, the doc and his wife, and then, the couple who even drove out of their way to deliver him. He must have been a very nice guy and good at communication, I suppose. Anyways, that's one lucky fella. Let's move on without wasting more time. The next answer to best experience with police officer is by Jay Hartley. He is an architectural and industrial photographer. He says, I was a college student in Illinois in the 1970s. I had an airline ticket to fly home to Houston for Christmas, but no money, except a couple of dollars in my front pocket. I decided I would hitchhike the 150 miles or so to St. Louis, where my flight was to depart. I left the university around noon, figuring that it would take 4 or 5 hours, 6 at the most, to get to the St. Louis airport. My flight was what they called a night coach flight that left for Houston at nearly midnight. Good plan. That afternoon there was plenty of traffic, but it was hard to get a good ride.
My first ride was 20 miles, nice of them to stop but not the kind of ride I needed. Hitchhiking went on for hours. Finally, as I neared St. Louis, but still on the Illinois side of the Mississippi, a trucker dropped me off in East St. Louis. It was 10 p.m., and it was dark on the freeway in spite of the tall lights on poles beside the road. I walked toward the Mississippi, a few miles to the west. With a crunch of gravel, an Illinois State Police car stopped behind me. The dome light came on, and the trooper motioned for me to get in the car. Gladly, I slid into his warm police car. The cop looked me up and down and said, "What in the world are you doing out here?" I replied, "Trying to catch a ride into St. Louis. I have a plane ticket home for a flight that leaves at midnight." He slowly nodded his head back and forth, with a sad frown. Kind of chilling, he made me sort of uncomfortable. "Son, do you have any earthly idea where you are?" I answered, "Pretty sure I'm about 5 miles or so from the big river. St. Louis is on the other side of the river. St. Louis Lambert Airport is on the north side. I think, son, all that might be true, but where you really are, is right in the middle of the murder capital of the whole United States. No kidding, more murders here than anywhere. And you're just walking down the road." He turned his dome light off, and put the police car in gear. He pulled out and accelerated. "I'm going to jail?" I squeaked out. "No son, you're going to St. Louis." A few minutes later, we pulled up in front of the Bel Air East Hotel, in downtown St. Louis. There's an airport shuttle that leaves this hotel every 30 minutes. "Get on it and get home." I nodded my head and asked, "How much does it cost?" The cop looked at me and said, $4, you got $4? Well, not really, I bought a candy bar, and a Coke this afternoon, and that was sort of the end of my money. The brave, and true Illinois state trooper reached in his pocket, pulled out his wallet and extracted a $5 bill. He handed it to me, tipped the shuttle driver $1, they gotta eat too. I stepped out of his car, and he left me in front of the hotel without a look back. He might very well have handed me the rest of my life that evening, and $5 to boot.
Hats off to the true Illinois State Trooper. These kind of stories not only help me believe in the human beings but also triggers mine good deeds. I think all the good deeds you did will return eventually to you, and you will be glad that you did so in the first place. What am I talking about? Sometimes I may get out of track, please pardon me. Anyways, without further ado, let's get to another answer. But before that, let's get the question up once more. The question is, what is the best experience you have had with a police officer? Anonymous, but we will know he is a retired soldier from the story, says,
"One of my daughters is a nurse, and one evening she told me she would be filling a night shift for one of her friends at the mental health hospital. I was quite alarmed, as this was not her usual role. I am a retired soldier and I asked her to learn a couple of moves that would get her free if she was attacked. She let me show her, and practiced a few times, but wasn't that keen because she was a typical smart young girl who didn't need this type of lesson. Also, she assured me that a security guard would escort her to her car and would also check it to make sure it was safe for her. And she added that the staff car park was outside the secure area where all the really dangerous people were kept. I waited up to make sure she got home safely. When she opened the front door, she was covered in blood all over her white uniform. She told me she needed to change and have a shower, and that 2 cops would be arriving to talk to me. Sure enough, within a minute, there were 2 big cops standing at my door. They asked if they could come in, so I agreed and we sat in the lounge area. Then one of them told me that, as my daughter was being escorted by the security guard to her car, he was attacked from behind by a guy holding a house brick that he had bashed the guard with. He had then grabbed my daughter, but, in a moment of clear thought, she remembered what I had practiced with her. The cop said that she managed to get free by snapping the attacker's fingers back. When he let go, she was able to kick him in the stomach, and then elbowed his face a few times. By the time 2 other guards got there, the attacker was laying on the ground, screaming his head off. And then, my girl, being a nurse, started to treat her guard, and stopped him from bleeding to death by holding his severed carotid artery and pinching it with her fingers. The blood on her tunic was from the guard. When these 2 cops arrived, they had to take this attacker to the nearest hospital to fix him up. But then, the cop paused as my daughter came back in and then he said, "Your daughter told me, you showed her how to look after herself, in a couple of minutes practice." I told him about my military background. Then he nodded his head, and asked, "Could you teach my daughters as well?" So I told him I could, and he could drop by one day, and he could watch me. But he turned that idea down, and suggested I come to his house for dinner one evening, and show them after. Sounded good to me, so I agreed. A few weeks later, it was arranged and he gave me his address. It was only 2 suburbs away, and I drove over just before the dinner was being served. But as I arrived at his house, there were at least 50 police cars parked on the street. But there was a cop, who directed me to a parking spot on the driveway. When I walked into the house, there were all these cops, plus their sons and daughters. This cop had mentioned in conversation the story about my daughter, and how she had learned from me. So virtually every cop on duty that night, had grabbed their children, and gone to this particular cop's house. They had all brought food along, and had a barbecue set up, and had plenty for me to eat. There were also a few wives, and some policewomen there, all wanting to learn how to defend themselves. I ended up having to arrange for groups of them to meet me somewhere so I could show them up close and personal like.
Wow. Simply, wow. I am really impressed by the daughter, 'cause she just practiced the trick few times, and was able to take down attacker without even getting one hit from him. She took the attacker completely down, that he was required to hospitalized. Really, wow. The training that Dad had given to her must also have been effective and efficient. I agree to that. Alright. Now let's move to the another answer. This one has more role of a police officer's dog than it is of the police officer. Let's hear it out. Ron Rule, CEO at As Seen on TV says.
One night back when I lived in Florida, my Jeep's alarm goes off in the middle of the night. I go outside to find the window unzipped, and the back door open, but nothing missing. And no one around. The thief probably wasn't expecting a Jeep with half doors and a soft top to have an alarm, but as soon as they reached inside and pulled the door handle, the alarm went off and they took off running. So I call the cops out. They try to take some fingerprints, but can't lift any from the top and textured materials, and the would-be thief didn't touch any of the smooth surfaces. Then, the K9 shows up, and they ask me if I would go inside, so they could see if the dog can get a hit. The dog picks up on something, and starts leading the officers toward the back of my neighborhood. They continue out of the neighborhood through the woods, around the edge of the lake, over the railroad tracks, through some more woods, right up to the door of this crappy apartment, over a mile away. So, they knock on the door, and some 16-year-old kid answers. The dog signals to the officers that this is the source. They question the kid, and he swears he's been at home the whole time and didn't take anything. So one of the officers explains how the dog tracked him there, and the kid confesses. Since he didn't actually get a chance to take anything, or damage the Jeep, they couldn't charge him with burglary or destruction of property, but they were able to get him on trespassing. The cops were great, but honestly, I was most impressed with the dog.
Not only you, Ron, I am also pretty darn amazed by the capability of the dog. He just smelled, and found the suspect a mile away. That's amazing. Police officers would not have been able to find that guy if it was not for the dog. Good dog. Now we are almost to the end of today's Quora questions and answers. We have one last short and sweet answer put forward by Andrew Bosworth. Let's hear him out.
When I was 16, I was driving alone from a youth conference in Sacramento back to my home, in the Bay Area. It was pretty late, I was tired, and even I could tell, I was driving erratically. I'd glanced down at the speedometer, and it would be 20 miles above or below the speed limit, in alternation. I really didn't have the driving experience to realize how unsafe this was. I got pulled over by CHP. As I pulled off the road on an off-ramp, I was pretty nervous as this was the first time I had ever been pulled over. The cop came over and got my license and registration, but he never ran them. He just said that they had been following me for a while, and that it was clear to them that I was trying to drive safely but not able to do so. I told him where I was coming from, and that I was just trying to get home. He explained that driving tired is just as bad as driving drunk. Instead of giving me a ticket, he pointed down the off-ramp to a place I could get some coffee and rest. He asked if I had enough money to get some coffee, and offered to give me some if I didn't. He said, if I really couldn't get back to an alert state, that I should call a friend or my parents and get a ride because what I was doing wasn't safe for myself or other drivers. Honestly, I can't imagine that getting a ticket would have had nearly as big an impact on my driving as the short, compassionate conversation that officer had with me that night.
Yes, as I said, short and sweet one. Well, that's all for this episode of Cop Stories. I will catch up with you guys in another video. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more amazing, wild, and spectacular stories from Quora. If you guys have more interesting stories, especially police officers, please share yours in the comment and I will definitely put it in our upcoming videos. See you guys.